All right. I'm going to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. In my speech, I'll prove 3 things. First, I'll prove why this policy is justified and why it's necessary given Nigeria's political structure. Secondly, why this leads to better accountability. Thirdly, why this leads to massive development and a trickle-down effect on preventing things like overcrowding, massive internal migration within Nigeria from poorer states to richer states, massive natural disasters that come as a result of mass unplanned settlements like floods, fire outbreaks, etc., given climate change and its externalities that are happening within Nigeria. But then let's talk about what this policy looks like. I think the motion says this House would transition. There's a fiat that this would happen. Obviously, the mechanisms by which this would happen looks like state committees that are independent or away from political governmental changes. And so this debate cannot be that, or if there's a change in government, the government would stop doing it. Secondly, note that legislators at the state level would actually embrace this, and I would explain why. Because most of the time, the Constitution, because Nigeria is a federal state and not a unitary state, places extreme responsibility on the state as to their constitutional and political mandates, the extent of development that they are responsible for, yet the financial model within the state does not give them enough financial power over the revenues that are generated. And so usually they are found wanting because the citizens are told they are responsible, yet they do not control the money to be able to deliver on those responsibilities. And so the legislators, the people who are in the assembly, who are likely to be passing this vote, are likely going to embrace this. And so there is enough political will to guarantee that this happens. I just gave you a free mechanism independent of the fiat. So again, the policy or the counter push cannot be that this will not happen or this will happen poorly. Secondly, let's then talk about the problem with redistribution. Because even though the Infoslide tells you a very beautiful framework around redistribution, most of the time in practice, majority of the characteristics or factors are skewed towards bigger states. For instance, richer and more developed states attract massive migrants from other parts of Nigeria, which means when it comes to population, they end up having it. A lot of them have larger land size, they have more taxation or more companies based in there. So they end up retaining in terms of redistribution and larger portions of the shares. So what ends up happening is that Nigeria's development is lopsided, where for certain richer states, they just keep retaining a lot more of the share, but poorer states just keep getting poorer. Now I would analyze why this becomes one of the fundamental reasons why there's deep ethnic and political weaponization of poverty within Nigeria and why this leads to much more political instability in that state. But then 3 main arguments. First, on justification. Nigeria's political structure is not a unitary state like Ghana, where I come from. For instance, in Ghana, it's a central government. It's a unitary state, which means the government bears all the political responsibility within the constitution, and therefore, when they control all the money, it is fine. In Nigeria, because it's a federal state, there are unique constitutional empowerments that are given to the states independently. But what this also looks like is a lot more specific and explicit developmental responsibility that is placed on the state. For instance, you are responsible for constructing roads, providing education access, funding a certain portion of the school's budgets, etc. What this means is that the Nigerian constitution is designed in a way that places more responsibility on individual state government compared to what unitary states would have. What this means is you cannot have a federal state in terms of its political structure and then run a unitary financial model, because they are non-complementary. Because what ends up happening is that the federal government controls the funds, but the individual states are the ones responsible for the obligations that the citizens expect from the state. And that means that a lot of the time, people are unable to fulfill their obligations. And the federal government always engages in blame game by saying that it's the state that is responsible. But the state also blames the federal government because the state says, we don't get enough money anyway. What this creates is an opportunity for people to keep blaming each other, whereas the citizens do not have an independent and clear entity to hold accountable. That confusion as to who is clearly responsible means that it's difficult to consolidate accountability mechanisms around a state agency. We say, and I'll prove to you down the line, why making it clear and allowing states to have more control over money centralizes accountability efforts on the state government, and that means that there's more intense accountability, there's more directed protest, and there's less vicious distortions of protest efforts. Before then, closing up. Opening up.
Okay, so closing.
Yeah, closing. Go
Okay,
ahead. Hurry up.
so if it is a federal state, chances are these federal states are probably contributing to the economy specifically, even if it is not pragmatically good. Things such as a pure agricultural country. How do you think this states will survive on your side?
Like the motion says,
Oh,
when like no when the motion says there's still a slight minority of portions of taxes that given to the federal state. And like I said, the federal states actually don't need that amount of money because majority of the civilian population's responsibility and their needs is not placed constitutionally on them. So we don't care if they don't have like billions of dollars sitting in the bank doing nothing and exploiting it from corrupt circumstances. Secondly, the reason why this model is justified is because usually when major resources are exploited from individual states, the states and the people who reside in it are the ones who primarily bear the cost of those distractions. For instance, very intense and direct black rains in oil drilling communities and states. And also, those activities directly deprive them of access to other opportunities by which they can gain revenue. For instance, if oil drilling is destroying your water bodies, it destroys your ability to become a fisherman. It destroys your ability to become a farmer because the water is constantly polluted. We think they deserve majority retention of those revenues within their states. Thirdly, most states or alternative states also have alternative resources. For instance, agriculture is massively in the north. You have copper, gold, lithium, rare earth minerals. There are other states that have industrial center, fintech, etc. So the argument cannot be that some states will become desolate and poor. Almost every state in Nigeria has something that they can generate massive revenue from. What this creates is better accountability as an impact mechanism because it's easier access to the people and the government structures that people need to hold accountable because the state government usually are easy to access. It's easy to mobilize around them, but also they've proven to be less militarized and less murderous because when people try to protest against the federal government of Nigeria, they kill them, they gun them down in the streets. And the comparative state agencies on the state level are less militarized, and so there's less bloodshed, and so accountability and protest are far more effective on that comparative. Thirdly, this creates more development because you have more money residing within the state, and you have more political accountability that's adding pressure. But also, this reduces massive internal migrations that creates slums within these big cities that causes environmental problems like floods, fire outbreaks, etc. There is no way in which you look at this Nigeria and think you don't want this policy. That's why we propose this motion.
thank you for that wonderful speech, Prime Minister. Now to open the class from the opening benches, calling on the Leader of Opposition. Here.
Okay. Cool. Just let me get my timer ready. I'll begin. For POIs, please unmute. Priorities to closing government for the sake of engagement. I'll begin. Again, DSM, I don't know what was happening in the out rounds, but if the similar sentiments are shared here and it's the last time we're speaking, I mean the silent rounds and it's the last time we're speaking, well, it was really lovely speaking with you. Okay, I'm gonna start then in 3. Okay, in 3, 2, and 1. I'm willing to admit that states deserve fiscal autonomy. I mean, greater fiscal autonomy because they do. I don't think this debate is also about whether Nigeria's federal structure has serious flaws because it does. The actual question is whether replacing redistribution with pure derivation creates a stronger federation. We think no, because federalism is not simply an accounting formula. It is a constitutional agreement that transforms multiple competing societies into one political community. Let's talk about constitution for a second. A federation exists because people accept 2 reciprocal obligations. that wealth generated anyway belongs partly to everyone, that everyone has a stake in preserving the union. So redistribution is not charity per se. Redistribution is the constitutional price each region pays for everyone else remaining invested in the same country. So pure derivation destroys that reciprocal obligation because it tells every single state what is yours, what happens everywhere, also is no longer your concern. Within the moment wealth stops flowing nationally, political loyalty also becomes local, right? I think once fiscal interdependence disappears, the federation no longer functions as a federation. It becomes 36 neighboring governments negotiating temporary coexistence. This framing decides the round because the point when OG tells you, well, states become more efficient. We tell you efficiency is meaningless if the political architecture holding the country together disappears in that world. The first argument is that, federalism survives because everyone needs everyone. The first reason here is the idea of pure derivation destroys the national stake, right? We think today every governor walks into FAAC knowing that let me call it FAAC, knowing that the prosperity of another state partially determines the prosperity of their own state. That creates a common Nigerian interest. So pure derivation removes that incentive overnight for three reasons. First, fiscal independence becomes political independence in their world. Why? Because once every state keeps nearly everything it produces, the federal government no longer distributes prosperity. It simply invoices states. So when Bayelsa retains hundreds of billions while another state retains almost nothing, those numbers become public constitutional facts. So secessionist movements no longer argue emotionally, they argue mathematically. They say, we already fund ourselves, so our bill just simply extracts administrative fees. The debate shifts from identity to accounting there. That makes separatism appear economically rational rather than politically radical. But the second reason here is because the idea of the national cake, it disappears. The national cake chair has always been criticized, but it performed an invincible function because it makes every Nigerian believe that prosperity somewhere eventually benefits everyone. Without the redistribution chair, success becomes geographically exclusive. So an investment we think every investment like pipeline and port stops being a national asset in that world. It becomes territory worth asking, how do we grow Nigeria? But they begin asking, should we pay for anybody else? But the third reason is because federal institutions lose their moral authority. Because today, begin asking, what exactly is the federal government for? If it neither funds schools, nor hospitals, nor salaries, nor development, then the center becomes a constitutional its power does, and legitimacy always collapses first chair. Even if OG proves that states becomes richer, they never explain to you why richer states will remain political. But the second argument is that federalism is sustained by mutual dependency, right? It can't be sustained by mutual affection. OG assumes the people remain Nigerian. Really beneficial for three reasons. First, every state stops investing in national stability. Right, we think, why should Lagos finance security operations in Bono? So under pure derivation, there's no fiscal incentive to do this, right? We think security becomes local, poverty becomes local, instability becomes someone else's problem. So the federation slowly loses collective action here. But the second reason is that political coalitions become regional coalitions. So today's elections require broad national bargaining because revenue is shared nationally. Why? So once a wealth is retained locally, elections stop revolving around federal redistribution, but regional blocks become politically self-sufficient. That means negotiation in that ward decreases. That means polarization increases in that ward, right? Because it's literally region specific. But the third thing is that every crisis becomes regional. That means diseases, floods, banditry, economic shocks. Nobody contributes voluntarily to problems that no longer affect their revenue. So collective insurance disappears in that ward, and the federation loses the very reason federations exist. exists, which is risk sharing. Compare the principles, Chair. OG believes ownership here creates the responsibility. That is not true. Ownership without the obligation destroys that solidarity. We think a federation cannot survive if every member behaves like an independent shareholder. It survives only when everyone accepts paying for problems they did not individually create. That constitutional bargain disappears under pure derivation. But the third argument rather is that the model begins like a self-reinforcing cascade of disintegration. But before I move on here, I haven't heard the POI so far. Let me take one.
POI?
Yeah, sure.
What do you think was the foundation of the Biafra War?
I really don't know how that has anything to do with emotion. So it's if you want to prove that, go do it. Sure thing. Okay. I think OJ treats derivation as a budget reform. It is actually an incentive revolution. I think every actor, well, Biafra was for resource control then. I think every actor changes behavior simultaneously. Those behavior like reinforce one another. First, resource wealth becomes like localized state capture because today corruption is constrained imperfectly by federal oversight and conditional grants and national security. But pure derivation concentrates enormous revenues inside individual state governments for three reasons. First, governors stop depending on taxpayers. So if oil funds your budget, citizens becomes politically unnecessary. So accountability declines because governments no longer need public consent to raise revenue. The classic resource curse simply moves from Abuja to 36 capitals. But the second reason is that resource communities learn that they can shut down production. So every interruption immediately hits state finances. So communities discover that blocking pipelines produces instant concessions there. So extortion becomes institutionalized. So production falls, investment leaves. The resource curse intensifies. So poor states collapse into permanent fiscal crisis because states without major resources cannot finance school, healthcare, or civil servants. With that, never been prouder to oppose. Here.
Thank you for that wonderful speech, Leader of Opposition. Now calling on the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hi, I'm audible. Can you give me like 30 seconds? I'm just like still putting on some notes on the yellow speech, so. Okay, I'm good to go. Sorry about that. If you have POIs, do interrupt verbally because I'm not looking at the chat space. Sorry about that. I think I'm good to jump. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. And this POI is going to win OG today's debate before the closing half even starts because O doesn't know what you're talking about, right? The first reason why you're going to lose is that when Biafra was like a thing in the 1960s to 70s in Nigeria, the biggest justification that the states of Biafra was giving is the fact that they felt that their oil revenues were being used to keep other states afloat and those other states were not contributing to their sustenance. And it's kind of sad that Nigeria probably never moved off of oil dependence and they're probably still on oil dependence. That argument still lingers. That's why when you look at Nigeria right now, there are a lot of like ethnic conflicts and some tribal conflicts, and most of those are economically flawed because like the World Bank even published a report that says if you can improve the poverty rate, like I mean the economic rate in Nigeria and help people to be more economically afloat, they would not be more susceptible to all those arguments that these leaders push to them to recruit them into their like conflict factions. Why we are the team that is likely going to solve those rhetorics and prevent certain radical leaders and ethnic leaders from like pushing such narratives onto the people to recruit them is the fact that pure derivation is going to be the policy to make sure that that is reduced. How? The first thing is that we would note that oftentimes in Nigeria, most states like kind of say that our resources are not being used to our own benefits, right? They say, for example, like Delta states and like those eastern states where oil are based, they say, well, all the federal government does is collect all our revenue and use it to make other states better. Therefore, don't come to our states. Sometimes they say, Lagos is so choked, so leave Lagos. Let us keep our own economic hub and keep our resources for ourselves. We need the Northerners to go back to the North. Then the Northerners say, in that instance, we're not going to send our agricultural produce down to the South anymore. Let us export our agricultural produce out into Nigeria. And the government later even had to put some bans on Nigeria from exporting like those agricultural products out of Nigeria to those other states. The argument for this is to say that in status quo, the FAAC model is really not working because states are feeling that their contributions are not being rewarded adequately. This proves that every argument in theory that OO gives you from the textbook doesn't work because a simple reality check shows that the kumbaya theories of federalism and we would all love each other in economic interdependence and we are all going to get out of poverty and prosper and sing under the sunset doesn't work because currently these are the issues we are seeing in the freaking news. That means then that something has to be done and this policy is going to be the solution for that. What is the second thing OO tells you that we're simply going to rubbish out of today's debate? What the other thing they say is to say that problems are going to become localized, and this is not going to work for Nigeria because if you have things like poverty being localized, security being localized, simply the country cannot work. The first thing to note is that this argument ignores the fact that it's a policy debate, and Andy gave you a framework on how this would work. This means then that we're likely going to have things like constitutional amendment, for example, that would mandate that these guys have to pay some taxes to the federal government to provide security overall. So it's unclear how you're going to have more insecurity because the federal government would not have any money to do any of these things. I think apart from state security guarding the state economic resources, the federal government can tax these states, and it's not a matter of donate the money. It's a constitution, it's a law, it's a machinery. They are going to have to give some portion of that money, not a lot, and they can use that to do all of these things that need to be done. But there is also another argument about how they say other communities are going to hold other communities ransom and try to disrupt their trade. It's unclear to me why they would want to sabotage themselves because from all those arguments, they point out that economic interdependence is going to be key, right? So if you know that you want to do tourism, for example, and there is a river that flows from your state to Kano State or the Eastern State, you don't want to probably block the river because you're getting tourism revenue from that state, right? Like from that river, and that river lies between two states. So I don't think they would want to sabotage themselves insofar as all of those incentives for the people to vote out their governors are a thing that can affect them. Let's consolidate the win from opening government then. Two extensions. The first is one that is going to talk about how this pure derivation policy is the best way to transition Nigeria's economy as a whole to the next phase of the global economy. Panel, look, the world is largely moving on from like give us your crude oil, and let's make you rich. Because they are doing things like manufacturing, technology, some services, some renewable energy, and value-added exports. That means then that oil, which is for so long, for like 60, 70 years, has been Nigeria's main base of economic, like the key to drive the economy forward, is facing certain vulnerabilities, right? It's vulnerable to things like price volatility, some global demand fluctuations, and like maybe energy transitions. That means then that they cannot build their entire future around hoping that oil is going to remain their primary source of wealth. What we are arguing from OG, therefore, is to say that pure derivation is going to force and incentivize that transition to happen. How? If you have states like Lagos focusing on doing the fintech stuff, I've forgotten the name, man, but like there's this payment platform that they built that's like so global, right? Paystack, that's the name, Paystack, right? They are forcing themselves to be that economic hub, right? You have certain like states that have Dangote cement, for example, making sure they can export like manufacturing stuff. You have states that have innocent car motors trying to manufacture cars, maybe trying to get like some subsidies and some foreign investments so they can start making EV cars. These are the kind of things that can happen because those governors, like they probably campaign to their people that vote for me to become the state governor of Anambra State or Enugu State, and when I come, I would make sure this company expands so they can give jobs to all of you. The impact, however, is that Nigeria as a whole becomes more diversified off of oil, because oil is only literally down in the south and the east and is nowhere up in the north. Those northern guys need to wake up and go, what do we promise our people to make sure they are giving us the electoral mandate so we can diversify? Yeah, shoot, what's the POI? Let's go.
So since we are discussing Nigeria, the two model of financing different states is FAAC and internal generated revenue. Why is internally generated revenue by this regional state not enough for you in status quo?
No, status quo, the reason why it's not enough is because everybody is sitting with their hands out open, waiting for the federal government to come and save them. But the thing is, the federal government doesn't have so much checks on them because, like Andy told you, the people are not really looking at the federal government to save them. That's why Tinubu doesn't do much, but he still wants another 4 years because, like, he literally doesn't have to do much. He will tell you, go to your governor for your electricity whilst you're in darkness because he's not being expected by the constitution and the mandates to do much. That's why he can get away with it. This pure derivative finance means then that the resources out of Lagos needs to be accounted to the people of Lagos. Insofar as you are taxing them and they are working in that state and they are making sure that they are giving you the most of their economic returns, right? What is the summary of everything OG gives you before the closing half comes in? Because note, the first thing is that it's a policy. OG has shown you exactly how this is going to work and how all problems that might arise in the transition phase are things we can fix with the policy. So can OO or CEO say, well, sure, what if they don't want to pay the taxes to the federal government? What if the federal government is going to be poor? These are all things we can fix with policy. So for example, if you elect a federal president, they can go to the World Bank for money. They can go to the IMF for money. You don't need your state governor to be the one to go for that money. That means the federal government will still probably be fine, but we are empowering the state actors to be the one to diversify and respond to the mandates given to them when the people vote for them. It's been a good day to break to the finals. Vote OG. Here.
After 7 minutes and 15 seconds, I will no longer be writing anything you say. So with that, calling on the Deputy Leader of Opposition, here.
Okay. 30 seconds to wrap up on my notes for DPM, and then I'll start exactly that.
All right.
Okay, so I'll just keep my mic open. All right, so I think I'm set now. Chair, I'll be taking a POI from closing. In the absence of closing POI, I'll take OJ. But I'm specifically prioritizing opening closing government in this round. Thank you. Zwanga, it's really been a nice one. I think we would definitely break. So there is no need for you thinking this is going to be the last time. Okay, so starting my speech in 3, 2, let's go. Currently in Nigeria, there are 3 problems that every single citizen cry about. And I think this is very, very factual because not just because I'm a Nigerian, but I think it's something anybody can most likely research online. The first is what opening government talks about, the unfair treatment that exists between the federal system and the state. And the unfair treatment are specifically sponsored by regional politicians who just sit on the state internally generated revenue and push all the blames on the federal government. Don't take my word for it. Take the DPM's response to my POI for it. I asked a simple POI. Nigeria currently practices 2 different models of revenue generation. The first is the FAAC. The second is the internally generated revenue. I then ask, why is the internally generated revenue not enough to consolidate upon the meager treatment they say they are getting from the federal government? They said, oh, it's because people are waiting on the money from the federal government. It means that they intentionally choose not to use anything meaningful with the internally generated revenue that individuals get from within region. That simply explains why, when it is during the general election period, just like this particular point in time, a lot of people are currently waiting, expecting to have a new president. Nobody specifically questions who is the new local government chairman from within those specific region. Nobody specifically questions who is the new governor of this specific independent state. Why? Because all attention specifically is on the federal government based on that sponsored narrative that all money exists and end themselves at the federal government within those specific instances. What this singularly proves in this round is that even in a world where we switch the narrative to say, let states keeps all the money, we don't think this strategically translates to those independent politicians and leaders using those specific money for the good of those individual states. So two things they achieve in that regard. They have money on their side of the house, they defund the federal government, but the living existence of people from within those specific regions are most likely still deplorable. That shows you why their policy falls, because they don't translate the extent to which the practicality of this policy currently changes the narrative that currently bedevils Nigeria. We win them on that particular instance. The second thing that every single citizen talks about is, why is population density a problem to things like national development? And I think this responds to Prime Minister. But what Prime Minister says is that what justify migration, and Chair, please listen to this, because it's going to be a demechanization of what Prime Minister says. Prime Minister said, what specifically justify migration is that a lot of people move to richer states because of the incentive for them to be better self-actualized at this specific state. A few examples they gave to you were Abuja, Lagos, Port Harcourt, which happens to be where I am debating from. There are three reasons why these specific cities face a whole lot of problems. Number one is that they are so rich and too big, such that their dependence on things like the federal allocation is most likely insignificant. Why? Because of the proliferation of different governmental institutions, big international governmental cooperation that exists within these particular spaces. Companies that are too big to fail, that are continuously remitting funds, taxes, and paying it directly to this independent state coffer. Those are the incentive and opportunity that drive people to those specific spaces. Myself left Port Harcourt to migrate to Abuja. Why? Because of bigger opportunities that exist in those specific cities. Why can't I go to Nasarawa or like Kano or some bunch of like poor states in Nigeria like Ondo State? The reason I won't go to either of these minority simple states is simply because there are not enough opportunity as much of this mega city. What this proves in this particular debate are two things. Number one, the fact that concentration of governmental projects still exists among some different cities, it does not specifically help those weaker states to structurally develop themselves unevenly. Why? Number one, because they don't have any form of like natural resources that they could most likely leverage as a channel towards how they necessarily needed to develop. It means the expectation of them paying some form of like taxes to state is most likely non-existent. But two, it means that more people from those particular states would even migrate more to those mega cities. It definitely becomes a population crisis for those specific mega cities, because the more concentration of opportunities means that you cannot necessarily control things like population overloads. The second impact, it means that there is no delta that exists from opening governments, because those particular problems will most likely exist invariably. The comparative, FAAC, it means all states are specifically forced to diversify every single form of like resources they have, whether federal government handed down resources or the internally state generated own. It means the switch should not be, let us change the financial model. The switch should be, let us critique why the system is not working based on the wrongful allocation of resources that these specific states use their revenue specifically to do. In a world where they don't do that, it means there's no form of like significant change that exists on opening government side of the house. There's the last beautiful extension I'm going to be using to integrate the last reporter. But before then, I take a POI specifically from CG. CG, please shoot. CG, please shoot POI. No. I want to take CG first. 3, 2, go. CG did not engage. OG, please shoot.
The Infoslide literally says all collected income, mainly from oil, customs, duties, and taxes, is centralized to the national government. So you don't get to say they have IGF. Where is the IGF when their taxes and all income is taken? Like,
yes, we are discussing Nigeria. Your DPM also inserted that when they said what erupted or what created the Biafra war was the fact that these individuals were not well treated. If we are discussing Nigeria, we also need to bring in factors that the Infosite specifically did not cover, invariably so far as it is something that is legitimate in this round. But listen, the fact that the federal government also, and this is the last extension that directly takes OJ out of this debate, the fact that the federal government exists as an independent and harmonizing body that does a lot of like duties that states don't have the capacity to do, that invariably justify why resources specifically have to go to them. Because in a world where you prioritize regional independence by the virtue of different resources, not only do you have weaker states, you also have the disintegration of that particular federal system. If the state still exists as a federation invariably, it means there needs to be a level of power asymmetry that grants the center enough power and ability to harmonize different interests and different political games within those specific instances. The mechanism is not that the fundings are not enough. The mechanism is the routes through which those specific funds are being used are things that are not specifically efficient. That in itself is a delta that opening government did not prove. Two reasons why opening opposition wins this debate. The first will prove that if Nigeria remains a federal state, it needs to incorporate itself within what the federal structure functions by. But two, the allocation model is not the problem. The problem here is what you specifically use the funding for. If you question those specific leaders, if you question those specific structural projects in itself, it makes more sense for any form of resources you get to be much more useful. This is why we bring to the final.
Thank you for that wonderful speech, Deputy Leader of Opposition. Now to start the exchange from the closing houses, calling on the Member of Government here.
Hi, am I audible and visible? Actually, I won't use camera.
Yep.
Okay. Give me a second to start my timer. To start with my timer. Before I'd like to start my speech, I would like to just say thank you to my partner Sydney for carrying me throughout this tournament, and super thankful that we got to break. Okay. Starting my speech on my next word. Let's start with OO. OO's case is built on these harms and negative material that basically talks a lot about how Nigeria is currently suffering because of this, or if we transition into this, we are suffering because of these numerous problems. We tell you that those numerous problems already exist within status quo, and in fact, it is exacerbated within the current FAAC model, and is not properly regulated. The worst what's happening right now in status quo is that worst case is that these states, not worst case, the median case is that these states in the first place are not able to utilize the money that the money that is being brought to them, or the revenue that they're able to produce, while simultaneously being put down or being cut or being simply incapacitated because of incapacitated due to the lack of actual revenue that they're gaining from their actual production from their industries, and which in turn exacerbates again the poverty and the problems that exist on their side. First, let's talk about risk sharing, because opening opposition loves to talk about how these states need to be able to band together, and because federally, politically, it makes sense, it is a part of their constitutional demand, right? We say that currently risk sharing doesn't work. The in the current status quo, in the current median case, you want stability. If one state is down because of oil sectors in a port city is currently being fucked, then that just means that all other states are hit. And this doesn't unlock the incentive that they're talking about, that other states will just necessarily help these oil ports, because an agricultural state like within the north cannot help oil ports. OO is empirically wrong. But secondly, on the extension of DLO, regarding the problem of population density, the problem with population density is not that the population is dense. These cities, and DLO says this themselves, have bigger opportunities, which is why today, because the incapacity right now is also because of the FAAC, because they have to give the percentage of their income to this pool, right? We have to consolidate upon certain harms or negative material that they're positing to us that already exists within status quo. So it doesn't make exact sense. Okay, moving on to something it's CG case from OG. OG tells us that wealth will get concentrated in states either way. Lagos will be states. We say it's bad because these finances don't actually get utilized. States as fiscal independence because it's good for the economic growth as a whole. Okay. Whew. Let's start with a few arguments, right? Nigeria necessarily, as established by the opening houses, is contingent, or a large chunk of Nigeria's economy is from oil deals, is from these oil cities and oil ports, and this is where quote unquote that they're going to get pooled in, right? This isn't necessarily true. There's going to be still mechanisms for trickle down effect. There's still going to be taxation. There's still going to be trickle down effect that goes down to these citizens in the lower ground in the first place, right? Fiscal independence has to occur within our side, or has to occur when this transition happens, because the current model of the FAAC is inefficient or insufficient in how it's going to conducting this, right? So what does this actually look like? We want for Nigeria to have this transition in order to have the kind of stability and security, in order for us to be less harmed, especially in volatile international cases in which OPEC or the ECOWA like unions and these FAACs are necessarily getting less investment because of countries being left, right? This means that under the current FAAC model, or what does this mean, right? This means that under the current FAAC model, in which poverty is already exacerbated and migration is already bad, it's going to get even worse because external international investment from other countries is actually getting pulled out or is getting reduced within status quo. This means that Nigeria has a large incentive in order to protect itself or to gain fiscal independence. And you're only going to get that if the states themselves that have unique products or unique products to develop their own economies locally and develop their own economies in a way that is able, in a way that grants them this fiscal independence. That is what you're going to get from closing government, is that we're able to capacitate more simply because we're able to secure more. We're able to secure more funds from what each state is actually producing, rather than trying to give it to other states, which in the first place is not is being used ineffectively, as is what's happening right now, and is what's happening right now, and then in our current model, what is going to happen is that we're able to use these funds to actually to push the virtuous economic cycle even further. That means greater pools of revenue from these specific states, like the port city states or the agricultural states, and therefore local development of the economy, and therefore greater institutions, and those institutions get to build themselves up locally every time. That is the largest impact that you get from us, and we're able to protect ourselves from the cases of OPEC and ECOWA, in which these spaces are going to get less investment or are more volatile, and therefore we are more protected as we are more independent. Okay. This also applies to places like Lagos, in which these service-based sectors are going to be able to still concentrate revenue within themselves, because we have to realize that there's a rising service-based industry within Lagos, and in order to continue to continue for them to develop, they need to still be getting a lot of the revenue that they're producing and then get it back equally. This allows us to build these local economies harder and gain fiscal independence on our side. With that, proud to propose.
Thank you for that wonderful speech, Member of Government. Now to start the exchange from the closing benches, calling on the Member of Opposition. Here, here.
Hello, am I audible?
Loud and clear.
Okay, wait. Setting my timer. Starting my speech in 3. POIs through chat. 2, 1. CO will be extremely simple. One, we will talk about human rights. Secondly, we will talk about accountability. Before that, 2 pieces of setup. 1, because this is not a world reset motion. In the worst case that every team fails in their impacts, the first substantive we bring you is that we think that poor federal states has a stake in the money of other states because there were national institutions used in generating that profit that are representative and spent by every state or in every state. That protection of major parts in some policies were protected by the military police to some extent, that national currencies are being used, and the taxation of all citizens were used to build oil extraction in some states. Secondly, we believe that every other metric from opening half is less relevant to the upholding of human rights because the creation of a state in and of itself and the effects of their policies and this policy were to protect and make people have access to fundamental human rights, things such as healthcare, things such as education, since we subjugate them to state coercion and policy. First substantive. Why does this policy deprive people of human rights, which goes against the social contract? So we will exclusively discuss the individual and the process debate. Because under this, in opposition, we think that money begotten by weaker federal states is more than the government because we take into account the states' population size, which is often multiplied by a lack of sexual education in poor states. That is why there is data that a poorer household may have more children or that weaker states often are bigger in landmass because they have to redistribute more resources to more people in wider areas. The current policy takes into account these factors, and this is a certainty as compared to the uncertain wealth accumulation mechanism you get from both government bench. What this new policy in government does then, because of this uncertainty, are 3 things. 1, against opening government's migration. In their side, you encourage more migration and extend to other federal states that are by virtue of law given oil reserves for industrial hubs, given major ports because they are used in international trading. The problem is that we make it harder for people to move out or to migrate, which is a fundamental right these people should have. We make those people spend more on self in their welfare because suddenly we do not provide it for them. Because we, in analogy, force everyone to leave but make it prison for these people, and therefore they have to stay and the state has failed. But the second mechanism is against opening government's independence claim, that we leave these weaker states who cannot fend for themselves because they were used to a national government giving them funds for state institutions in the interim, such as public schools, hospitals, and law enforcement. The reason why this is true is that federal states have the interest to use the profit within the region to invest in the private sector almost excessively because there's additional state backing in the public sector because of the additional budget you get from the state. What this means is that the profit generated from those private sectors in this new policy is not going to be used to maintain and reinvest in the private sector because stagnation often leads to decline. Notice how this results in public schools, hospitals, roads, and important infrastructures not being built or provided for in welfare. We think that even if a single tribe loses their access to human rights in government bench, this is a hubris to the state. But thirdly, notice how they leave necessary states to fend off for themselves. We're going to hijack and vertically extend in leader of opposition's mechanism that we think that in countries such as Japan, the Philippines, and Nigeria, certain states play a certain role or create a certain product for that country because they expect to be given a larger budget. For instance, purely agricultural states that have high opportunity costs are still being given a budget higher than their profit because the cost and maintenance cripples the federal state's ability to invest in their own electricity, transportation, and maybe even labor and capital. This means that not only do we deprive them of that expectation that in which we have a implicit contract within each other, even if they sacrifice for the state, we give them also less money for welfare, but we make products more expensive for everyone else in order for these federal states to break even. So if we give less support and if we give less money to these agricultural states, these agricultural states now have the incentive to heighten up the price and make it harder for everyone to access food and necessary tools and equipment to begin with. So even in this policy, we think that it affects everyone's access to the basic necessities in life. What do we think will happen if these 3 conditions were met? One, of course, there's going to be protests and violent rally, which clashes against opening government's harm. I'll take OG. later. Secondly, there's going to be more crimes of necessity and acquisition. And thirdly, the destruction of necessary infrastructure, such as the lack of irrigation in farmlands because of no subsidies. Within it and weighing, this is very, very simple. The people in opposition benches world have already adjusted to this world of policy. So even if there is some semblance of inefficiency and a lack of accountability, these people are already used to it, have developed means in order to live in this. What their side does then is to provide uncertainty and to possibly make those people not be able to adjust it to that extent. And therefore, there's going to be a harm in the process. In this substantive testament that one, the state has morally failed because people are seeking radical means and a removal of the criminal justice system in protection. But secondly, that the capacity to improve as a region needs is more than the profits they can actually attain individually. Before that, I'll take OG.
You just asserted that the agricultural states don't make enough money. Meanwhile, they do because of Nigeria's population, and they feel that the federal government is redistributing their money to undeserving states. Also, the status quo is literally the definition of human rights abuse. So I don't know what you are defending.
So it's a moral choice, right? So if you allow more people to be deprived of human rights, then that's horrible. But your example is literally a testament that in our side of the house, cultural states and states that are doing something for the entire state is actually flourishing insofar as this policy is actually happening. What you do then is to add that uncertainty. What if this already successful cultural federal state is in your side of the house gets less support and therefore gets more risk in actually doing all of those stuff? Second substantive on national stability and accountability. Because under this, you allow federal states to have the ability to be accountable because they finally have a choice in their policy because of the added budget we give to them, rather than being stuck with bad decisions because of poverty. So technically, even if opening government and closing government have more accountability, they literally cannot choose but to be held accountable because they have no money to actually make choices. What is worse in government bench is the lack of lobbying from the national government to hold the states accountable and to help them because we gave them all the control. In our side of the house, the national state can freely dictate national fiscal policies, include federal states in national plans in the future, possibly even buy off a portion of risk. In government, the national government has less control because each state has their own financial plan because they hold all of the money. If you make every state then more accountable, one, you allow the national economy to be more stable because you make them independent in the future from oil reserves, meaning in the metric of opening government. Secondly, you allow people to be able to afford migration or don't force them to migrate at all. And thirdly, you create more economic opportunities inside and outside the federal state because you allow the federal state to have more money to invest in private sectors, you create more jobs, you build more infrastructures can be built and used by everyone, and you allow more formal trade within federal states. There's certainty in the mechanisms of closing opposition. What you get from government bench is that uncertainty, proud to oppose.
Speech, member of opposition, now to crystallize the case coming from closing government, calling on the government whip here. Thank you for that wonderful speech, government whip. Now to crystallize the case coming from closing opposition, calling on the opposition whip here.
Yeah, hello, Sid. Both from I'm from TP. I don't know if you remember me.
I know you.
Yeah,
Hello.
great. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'll take off closing government from the map in this debate because they're just completely out of this debate. The only substantive that they were able to give is that the current FAAC model has or in the status quo already has poverty worsening, or for example, migration is already bad in the status quo. You're only able to get fiscal independence if they're able to develop their own economies locally. One, this principle only works if local economies have the capacity to develop themselves. This is completely unengaging with the frame that we gave to you come from mix. But for the vast majority of instances, you just cannot compare all dependent states from states that are agrarian or agricultural because obviously those are completely different things. And there's a concession in this debate that obviously the vast majority of income that you get from Nigeria are from all dependent states. So the natural conclusion is that all dependent states are completely much more richer. But secondarily, they had to prove that there's less poverty in theirs of the house. So for example, for the extension to hold in this debate, they just cannot assert symmetry. They have to prove that there's less poverty in theirs of the house. They weren't able to prove this. Their extension is a complete wash. The first question I'm going to ask in this debate is just quite simple. Is it principally justified to switch to the pure derivation-based model inside government bench? The first thing I want to note under this is that this is absent and independent of both pragmatic arguments that you get from opening half. Opening opposition never explains why other and wealthier states is principally responsible to help other small states in general, in vice versa. Three things. One, non-oil states are unable to access normal human rights, as we explained from regs, because currently it is the state that funds these things like medicine, like education, and things that are unable to access in theirs of the house or in their paradigm. But secondarily, even if some poor states have some type of tax being redistributed to them, we explain that it's not enough, and here's where the transition becomes dangerous, right? Because for the vast majority of instances, and within their own history, they have been doing all of their stuff with the money coming from the pooling in general. So the transition then becomes much more dangerous when you necessarily neglect these types of things independently, even if the tax actually gets from them. So even if you have some type of tax being redistributed to you coming from the national government, it is just not enough to sustain your own life because you have been living a life with different types of money in general. Thirdly, poor states has a stake to profit from rich states in general. That the vast majority of oil, and we explain from mix, and the clear mechanism towards this is quite simple. The vast majority of oil pumping machines, which makes richer states rich, came from money pulled in by poorer states in general, which means that they have a reciprocity, or they have the an obligation to pay them back in general, and to not necessarily leave them in the dark in general. What did government say under this? One, they said that it leads to war because some people feel that their money is being used to fund other people's life in general. Two things. One, the first thing I'd point out under this is that this is just a natural reaction to just every transition in history. I don't see why this is a bad thing. They never prove why this is a bad thing. But secondarily, I'll flip this. Political optics becomes much worse in this of the house because the vast majority of the North Nigeria, for example, are completely agrarian and agricultural. So when they necessarily feel poverty, and when they necessarily feel hunger within their own stomachs, this is where recession necessarily comes from, and more radical ideas necessarily stems from these grassroots areas. Secondarily, they said that, well, migration is currently bad. One, I'll completely flip this already. If migration is currently bad, that's because of regional inequality. Towards, for example, oil-dependent states or states that are currently richer. What this means is that wealthy states now gets migrated by so many people because you lack. So people from less richer states go to richer states and migrate towards them. This is a problem because wealthy states have the capacity to fund infrastructure. States become become lesser, or it depletes over time, necessarily killing them in the dark. This also flips the mechanism because you just cannot compete against agricultural states in the same thing. The second thing that they say is that, and their push coming from government is that the status quo is already bad. We should ready. So I want to read this already. Let's say that there's human rights abuse in both sides of the house. Easily reversible. There are things like checks and balances. There are things like international actors, and for example, things that you can just easily checks and balance the national government in general. But secondarily, even if it is human rights abuse in ours of the house, we're willing to trade it off because in theirs of the house, it gets much more exponentially worse because the human rights abuse in ours of the house only exists within oil-dependent states, which is like 7 or 8 states in general. It's the minority within Nigeria. In theirs of the house, you democratize and you democratize the human rights abuse because you give this towards agriculture and agrarian states who do not have the capacity to build their own economy in the first place. So in theirs of the house, people will get much worse off, and obviously people get much more angry in theirs of the house, which flips all of their mechanism towards secession and radicalism in general. The third thing that they say, lastly, is that, well, people look more towards their governors, people look more towards their localities, and there's just much more accountability mechanisms and all of that. One, like, they never prove where proximity equals accountability. If I just see my governor, doesn't mean that I uphold him to the same level of my national government. So, like, I just don't see the connection within this type of things. But secondarily, like, as we explained from Migs, it's easier to hold the national government as accountable because more eyes are obviously coming from people within this type of things. And obviously, like, they just cannot do anything if they're completely poor, and all of that. We explain that because it is about pooling it, because it is centralized, more people are able to join within these democratic institutions in general. Sure, I'll take OG.
Yeah, I think your justification, like it's just a blatant lie. Resource exploitation in Nigeria is done through revenue sharing, mostly with private companies, not the federal government buying machines and mining oil. So your premise of this system is just a fundamental lie. You need to engage the comparative.
So that's not the principle, right? The principle is that because the vast majority of infrastructures were claimed in history, obviously this is not a debate on which you go back in time. You obviously had done this type of things in the past, and obviously the state in itself has as an obligation to go towards poorer states in general, because obviously there are like people that you need to cater to. How then should you weigh this principle? How should you weigh the extension coming from Miggs in top half? The first thing I'd point out under this is that it is absent and independent of pragmatic of both opening benches, and currently it is a prerequisite towards the case of opening opposition, because because opening opposition relies on redistribution, or for example the price being the price that the people need to pay. We explain why that is the case, and we explain historically why innately richer states have the obligation towards poorer states in general, and vice versa. Closing up.
Thank you for that wonderful speech, Opposition Whip. Now to officially close the debate, you may now cross the house. So I think, can I ask everyone to proceed to the convening so that me and my panel can deliberate?